Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Interfaithing, Why Families Can Embrace Two Faiths Under One Roof. I am one of your co-hosts, Rev Anna, joined here by my favorite rabbi,
I
my
hope you be your
colleague,
favorite
and
rabbi.
yeah, my wonderful colleague and amazing co-host, Rabbi Ari. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Nice to see you, Ravana. We're recording this the week after MLK Day, and your introduction reminded me of something that I was giving uh, a teaching at an American at an AME church in one of my first pulpits in New Jersey. They have a special MLK Day service, and there was a reverend there who invited me to speak. And I said, my reverend, and I gave her name. And then the pastor who's in charge is a bishop, and he then said after I spoke, he said, "Rabbi, you may have your reverend, but I am your bishop." And it
That's
was amazing.
incredible.
It's like,
That's absolutely
right,
amazing.
you've got our reverend, our bishop, our rabbi, our all of those.
Yes. And now we have a bishop. I love that. Yes. And I think that's fascinating. Thank you so much for making that connection as well. That's incredible that you got to join and
It
participate
was pretty
in
cool.
an MLK service at an AME church.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who may not know, an AME church, that stands for African Methodist Episcopal, and it's a historically Black denomination here in the United States. Of course, it's global at this point, but it was founded, if you will, here in the United States. And so there is a relationship with the United Methodist Church, but very distinct as the African Methodist Episcopal tradition. So for you to be speaking
Yeah,
at
it was pretty cool.
a Black congregation in that context is just
And
incredible.
I have a picture that I've kept of my hands kind of going up as if like I'm really preaching over there. It was amazing. It was amazing.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And let us not forget that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had a close friend and ally in Abraham Joshua
Rabbi
Heschel,
Abram Joshua Heschel,
who
just teaching about
marched with
them.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah, who marched with him more than once, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting segue for this conversation to be happening right after MLK. Interestingly, one of the last times that I spoke at a church service happening after MLK was also in the context of our main topic today, which was the loss of an academic and spiritual mentor.
Mm.
So about 8 years ago, Dr. James Cone, who was somebody who was at Union Seminary and one of the main reasons that I chose to go and study there, he was also an Arkansas boy. A Black liberation theologian, and small world coincidence, my mother worked at a school with his brother.
Wow. So you got some.
And at the time, at the time that her principal was Charles Cone, I didn't have the awareness as a middle school, high schooler of who James Cone, the liberation theologian, was, but came to learn that afterward. And so had this rather unique opportunity to have a relationship that I don't think a lot of other people would have necessarily been able to enjoy, growing up in places like small town Arkansas, and then having that connection of my mother working with his brother,
Right.
etc.
You got that good yichus going, as they say in Hebrew. Good relationships.
Exactly.
Oh, you're from Arkansas. Do you know this guy? Do you know that one?
Yeah, and not only that, but another small world connection was my dad's first appointment when he finished his graduate school in seminary and then became ordained. His first charge back in Arkansas was in a tiny, tiny town called Bearden, which happened to be where James Cone was born.
That's amazing. That's
so
very, very cool.
All these levels, and that's a long introduction to say, when he passed, I found myself in Arkansas, and my parents also now attend what was a historically Black congregation in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and it's now integrated, but still a majority Black congregation. And in the passing of Dr. Cone, it happened to come adjacent to like an MLK service time of year, and I spoke in that context, partially out of the grief of losing somebody who was very important to my spiritual and academic journey. So here I am again in this context of receiving news of the loss of another person who was deeply, deeply influential to my spiritual journey and growth. Just last week, in fact, my college and my dad shared the news with me of the passing of another person. And dealing with that information, and especially having the recognition of the importance of what it means to grieve and go through that process of saying a farewell and recognizing the change that occurs when a loss happens in your life, particularly when it is a spiritual mentor. When we lose friends and family members, of course, it's also devastating. And we've touched on that, I think, in previous episodes, just talking about like the funeral experience and the full spectrum of life as interfaith families. But it felt important to me to use this example of losing a spiritual mentor to also bring that conversation to our interfaithing audience, because I do think it is the type of event and experience that can bring stuff up for people in an interfaith relationship, whether it's in my case, a college professor slash spiritual mentor, or if it's a beloved Sunday school teacher from your childhood, or somebody who played an important role in a synagogue that you attended. Those types of losses, I think, can potentially be catalysts for people in interfaith relationships to potentially think about their interfaithing journey through a different lens. And I also then reflected upon the fact that it was through the mourning of the loss of Dr. Sheila Gordon, who was the founder of the Interfaith community in New York, that brought you and I
Yeah,
back together
it's true.
3 and a little bit more, 3+ years ago. It was through that period of mourning and even just receiving the news about her passing
Yeah.
that was, I'm going to use the word catalyst again, to put you and I back in conversation. And then this
Yeah.
whole project was born out of
Yeah,
that.
I mean, grief and loss can definitely bring people back together in meaningful ways that, uh, you know, my dad just lost his father, who was 98 years old. And through this process, it has also been a chance to connect with members of my own extended family, some of whom I don't really see that often. Whatever every time that we lose someone, there's also something to gain. And hopefully that the memory of our loved ones and their spiritual mentors are going to continue to be a blessing so that we can be thinking of how their legacy will live on. And part of that is based upon the relationships that are built during that mourning period or during that grief.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating experience. And not that we are encouraging folks to move through the grief and mourning process too quickly. That is a process, and each event for each person is going to be on its own timeline. And in many ways, of course, we understand that grief and loss never completely leave us. It just shifts.
Mhm.
Learn to live with that loss
Yeah.
as opposed to any sort of forgetting, right? You
Right.
never get over people who leave us. And yet, as you were saying, I think it's a really natural and beautiful consequence of loss that we do have such a strong inclination to want to memorialize, pay tribute, and honor those who have gone before us by extending their legacy in some way.
So I'm curious, Ravana, especially since what was part of the catalyst of this episode is the loss of your spiritual mentor. If you can share a little bit about who that person was and what that person meant to you.
Absolutely. So the also a reverend doctor, a
Well,
reverend
all the
doctor.
best doctors are reverends,
Exactly. Like the
like the
both
very
and. Yes.
reverend.
The very reverend, yes. So the Reverend Dr. John Farthing, he was a professor at the college that I attended for my bachelor's degree, and I've spoken of another professor who really put me on the path around interfaith dialogue.
Hmm.
And he is still a very important part of my spiritual journey as well. But Dr. Farthing was the person whose classes really put me back on a path toward wanting to revitalize and learn to love again, specifically Christian theology. In many ways, I would probably say that his classes and his influence as a professor and a mentor took me to Union.
Mm,
because it was absolutely in one of his classes on contemporary theology that I started to see the name Union Seminary repeated over and over again by studying the names of people like James Cone, Reinhold Niebuhr, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, on and on. So he was, directly influential in aspects of my path. But even the fact that he was a professor who was actively serving a church at the same time. So he was a pastor professor, and oftentimes, students who studied with him would find a church home at one of his
mm,
congregations.
that's beautiful.
And it's just really, to me, there's a poignancy of the example of him being, using that phrase again, pastor professor, and then my own inclination to want to study Christian theology at a seminary
Mm,
where I knew that aspects of my personal faith and spiritual journey would be honored and
right.
through a much more academic lens. And the personalism
Yeah.
was something that I really cared about. And then also wanted to, when I first went to graduate school, I thought that I was going to be a path toward obtaining my doctorate and staying in academia and being a professor myself
Mm,
to, again, carry on the legacy of so many other people that had been so influential and impactful in my own life. Throughout all of those years in New York, becoming connected through the interfaith community, and I think even what you and I are continuing to do with this podcast is still rooted in an educational, like it's an educational avenue as
yeah.
well as a spiritual growth project as well.
I think that there's something really powerful about the notion, the mentors that you're referencing, and thinking about my own as well, that they're very particularistic. They come from a specific point of view, and that they connect you to a faith that is swelling deep within you. My grandfather, not my pop-up who just passed away, but my Saba,
Mm,
Rabbi
mhm,
Alexander M. Shapiro, who died when I was 10 years old. I often think about him and his writings. Been something that has been on my mind, especially in regards to the work of interfaith dialogue and interfaithing overall. Thinking about a teacher of mine when I was in Israel for my third year of rabbinical school, who was just a mensch and a beautiful Jew, somebody who really connected me to like the holiness of what Judaism has to offer. And then a professor of mine at JTS who was also very instrumental for me, Professor Dr. Neil Gilman, Zichrono Livracha, who was very instrumental in the lives of many rabbinical students. And thinking about that kind of model of what it means to be a Jew, to be a rabbi, I think that it's important to have those kind of models in our lives, those leaders, those spiritual advisors who can help us connect deeply to the real fundamentals of our particular faith tradition. What I found somewhat is that in working with some interfaith families and in doing some teachings in interfaith communities, that there is a feeling of, I'm not sure if it's concern or wondering or
mm,
maybe even a little bit of that loss, that by virtue of being interfaith, by virtue of wanting to engage in interfaithing, that they would lose an element of that particularistic spiritual tradition of having a rabbi, having a pastor who is so steeped in Jewish or Christian theology and practice that you want to model your life after them in certain ways. And I think that especially for interfaith families who may not necessarily have thought about their own lives as going down this path, but because of the person that they married, this is the right path for them. There's a lot of questioning as to like, is this going to work?
right. And again, it's completely natural that questions like that are either amplified or bubble up, even if we haven't considered them in quite some time through a loss event. It's completely natural that those types of things would arise in an individual. I think so much of our conversations recently have also been about reminding our audience not to react or make decisions like rooted in fear.
Mm,
And I think that there is sometimes an overlap of having like feeling afraid that somehow you're going to dishonor the person whom you cared about who is now lost if you act or don't act um, in accordance with what you feel they inspired or influenced or taught you to do. And again, that is probably like a very natural part of the grieving process because grief is hard.
Yeah.
Grief is really hard, and your, you know, internal and external world, depending on the person, are thrown for a loop.
Mhm.
So it's a really delicate process, and I think whatever arises within you, I hope anyway that if parts of our interfacing audience have recently experienced a loss or when anniversaries come around, that you can be gentle with yourself and just let those things arise.
Yeah.
It's fine for the questions to come up and you can share them with others. It may even be something that leads you into a relationship with a new spiritual mentor as a way of trying to process some of the questions and feelings that come up surrounding the loss of a previous spiritual mentor.
Yeah. So I think that what we're getting at here is thinking about loss and mourning and grieving in both a very particular kind of a way and in regards to the loss of a loved one who could be anyone in our lives who was a major
Mhm.
influence on us and that we've lost their presence in a way. And as well, that we're talking about overall the sense of loss that comes when an interfaith family chooses to embrace two different faith traditions within the home. We talk a lot about the gain, but there is a sense of loss of, if you raise children in an interfaith household, are they going to be a Jew? Are they going to be a Christian? To what extent do you think about those choices that you make as parents in terms of what your kids are? I will also say along those lines that there are a number of different couples out there who say, we're just going to let the children choose whatever it is that they want to become. And I think I want to be very careful about using those different terms because letting them choose, of course, every young person wants to choose to live their own life. My kids sometimes count down the days until they could be free to do whatever it is that they want to do. So freedom to
My
choose is
goodness.
something that's inherent in the experience, or desiring freedom to choose is something inherent in the experience of life of a child overall. But I think
Yes.
when it
Yeah.
comes to as a parent and thinking about the values, it's that we don't want to take a step back and just say, okay, the children are going to make that choice. We actually have to take a step forward. We have to be
Mm,
able to be proactive in
right.
offering a vision that is going to work for our kids and also for our families.
Hmm.
So, within the context of that proactive vision is a recognition within oneself about what you are comfortable with and what works for you, which is why we've always said interfaithing takes a lot of different forms. There's the interfaithing of raising your children fully within both traditions, there's having a primary religion. We've talked about that ad nauseum. But what I want to focus on now is because of the fact that a couple who are interfaithing decide to get engaged and and be involved with a person of a different cultural background, a different faith background, there is going to be some element of loss that comes from not having grown up with it and needing
Yes.
to be a part of something that is a little bit different. You could say a similar thing for intercultural, interracial relationships, ones where also maybe even language barriers, where someone's first language is Spanish and another one's is English. That there's the we talk about the what you gain, and there is a lot to gain, but I think it's important to take a step back for a second and think about what is it that we've lost and how do we feel about that loss and what is it that we have what is it that we need to do to grieve that loss so that we can move forward gently, as you pointed out before, not to get over it but to live with it.
Yes, because it's an element of change,
Right.
right? Like you
Yeah.
make a decision, two people are entering a relationship together, you come from different backgrounds. Our primary example is always, two different faith backgrounds. And as you make the decisions throughout your time together of what your life is going to look like, almost every time making a decision like means that you've also decided not to do something else. So there are like these micro losses every time that
Mm,
we make a decision,
yeah,
right?
I heard one economist talk about it as the opportunity cost. Right, by making
Yes.
one choice, you lose the opportunity to do something else.
Yeah. And maybe not forever, right? Like, I don't want us to, or I don't want our audience to be thinking about this in absolutist terms, that just because a loss has occurred or you make a decision as an interfaith couple to move down a particular path, letting go of some traditions, adding new ones, whatever that looks like, it's not an absolute decision. You
Mhm.
can change your mind again or even readopt or get creative and allow things to grow and shift and continue to change over time.
So what
And
what
I think,
what do you mean by that? Are there any particular examples of what you mean by that in terms of like that change, that shift of adapting?
I think we've had examples come up even with our Patreon members. Like one of the last times that we did a Patreon event, couples who were sharing with us how it was that their celebrations of the holidays shifted. First, when they, were newly married without children,
Mm,
then when the children were young, and then as the children grew up and became, kind of in that college, young adulthood age, and how their own ways of either decorating the house or incorporating certain holiday traditions together and how they wanted to spend time together as a family did not remain static over
mm,
time. It shifted. And partly, I think that's because as the children grew up, they also began to speak into what
okay.
those holiday traditions and aspects of celebrations look like. And therefore, the parents were like, oh, yes, absolutely. If this is going to make our kids happy and want to spend time with us and participate, then let's do it. Let's try something new this year.
Right, and when you try something new, it means that there's things that you won't do because you made that choice to do something new as opposed to what you've always done. And I think that that's also where, in thinking about the overlap between the loss that happens when you lose a loved one or a spiritual mentor or a dear person who had a certain impact on you, and the loss of a certain approach to faith tradition, that when it comes to our faiths and our traditions, that there is, I think, a very profound sense of how we want to keep those traditions going, and therefore we almost view them as frozen in time. I'll give one example of this, particularly in a Jewish way, and it has to do with the process of making Jewish law occur, or I should say, making Jewish law and decisions about how one should decide that something is kosher versus not kosher, or doing intermarriages, not doing intermarriages, as an example. And this was taught by a teacher of mine. Imagine that there's a chessboard and you're playing a game of chess. If the rules of how to do Jewish law, right, how to make decisions about Judaism is like a chessboard, each of the pieces have certain kinds of rules in regards to how those pieces move, and you're busy playing the game. He was describing that as to say, we as talk about conservative Jews, conservative rabbis, we're still playing the game. But there are certain Jews who look at the game and say, you know what? The game was played correctly up until this time. And then they put like a glass container over it in which the game is like stuck and no one's playing the game anymore. And you're
Hmm.
just trying to read what was done in the past. It's almost as if now, by virtue of the
Wow.
fact that these Gedolim, these great leaders have died and there's no one to
Mhm.
replace them, we now idolize the way in which it was done, and to say that we are doing it at definitely worse off than what they did. So the best thing that we can do is just to replicate or to imitate exactly what was done in the past. Because that's the other part of grief that I think can also be very dangerous, is when we have that feeling of loss and we
Mhm.
want to honor that loss, but we honor that loss in a way that keeps us standing still because we think that by standing still or by keeping things exactly as they were when that loss occurred, whether it was by a person or a certain way of looking at tradition or a certain way of doing tradition, that unless we keep it exactly the way that it was, that we are being disloyal to who they were, disloyal
Mhm.
to the tradition as it was. And so I think that there needs to be, in a way, some recognition that we all do in a variety of different ways, that the whatever it is that we have that formed us as people, right? Not even just talking about faith, but talking about as human beings, the influences we get from our parents, from our teachers, from our friends, from our colleagues, all of that,
Mhm.
that there is a concern, I think, that we take what is given to us and at a certain point in time we say, okay, now I have the answer. Now I know. Now it's the learning time is done. And I'm just going to keep doing exactly what has been shared and not continue to grow. And if
Right.
anything, I think that the leaders that my guess is, given what you've shared about your spiritual mentor and thinking about sort of my own stories about spiritual mentors or people who made a big difference in my own life, and thinking about what I love about tradition, it's actually the fact that they're so creative and
Yeah.
they're thinking about how to make this wonderful life continue to evolve in a more beautiful way. And it seems that standing still would be doing the exact opposite of what they would have
Yeah.
wanted for us.
Exactly. Yeah, that the standing still is in alignment with what I was saying a few minutes ago about the rigidity that can emerge from a sensation of fear of the dishonoring, the being disloyal, the somehow like not doing it right, and I'm putting that in air quotes. Um in regard to losing something and again having that sensation that if you stop doing an action or a tradition a particular way, that it will become like lost, absolutely, that it won't exist anymore. There's a way that we can have a mindset that's rooted in fear and rigidity. And that's, I think, whether it's the circle the wagons analogy that we've used or having this, I love that visual of like setting a glass container like on top of this thing in order to preserve it and try to
Yeah.
keep it perfect and then do our best to try to continue to imitate and replicate it over and over again. And that's an interesting connection to a previous conversation you and I had about, like the interplay of rituals and traditions is if your exercise of tradition has become so rooted in repetition only that the emotional connection to the why you exercise that tradition has started to get lost, then that would, in my opinion, like bring up some sadness, but also allow for that creative opportunity to say, what shifts can I make to still honor this tradition, but then incorporate it into my life so that the meaningfulness that it had for the originators, I also have my own meaningfulness for the way that I'm carrying it forward. And that in itself is paying tribute and honoring whether it's the thing, the tradition, or a person.
And so I think that that kind of creativity that comes from wanting to not just repeat, but to then do on your own. I think that um, one thing that is, I want to say a concern, but also a hope, kind of the same thing, is this in the desire to make things work in an interfaithing sort of way. It is easy to not engage so deeply with the faith, with tradition, but rather to look at it a little bit more just on a surface level. Because on surface levels, there are so many different kinds of similarities that we can hold on to, and the amount of time that it takes to really go deeper into faith is, well, it's almost like a game. Like, how much do I spend on this? How much do I spend on that? And and what do we want to do, whether it's as an individual, as a family, to be able to learn more about our traditions and about the faiths that make up who we are. And I think that there's something really important about the fact that if you talk to many people about faith and about tradition that those who want to continue the work have a mentor, as you're talking about it, who are steeped in a very deep sense of a particular understanding of what faith is. Now, that might be Judaism, might be Christianity, it might even be an interfaithing kind of a way of bringing those two different things together. But it is a very sort of profound, deep way of engaging in that learning. And what I want us to think about, both as like, Rev Anna, you and me and all other teachers of interfaithing families, is how can we continue to do the education, the primary education of what our traditions are all about? Because
Yeah.
only by knowing how things work can we really be able to then be creative at making the religion be creative and work together. To take the
Yes.
analogy of the chess game, right? Chess has very particular rules for how pieces work. And if you only know the rules for checkers, you can't play chess. And only if you've actually played chess with the rules and understanding those rules can you then be able to see how the game looks different at different points in time. I'd say that getting deeper into a religion, getting deeper into a religious environment and engagement is part of being able to understand those different rules or those different ways of how religions work together. And what I would say along those lines then is this. For an interfaithing couple, if you are concerned about whether or not you're going to pass along the tradition in a meaningful sort of way, if you're concerned about is there going to be a loss by virtue of me kind of doing this interfaithing sense and thinking about the mentors who you had or the examples that you had and wondering, am I being disloyal to them in some sort of way? I think the best way to feel that I'm not that is by going deeper into your own faith. You know,
Yes.
one of the stories I'm thinking of is when Vice President Kamala Harris was running for president. Her husband, who is Jewish, was
Mhm.
somebody who was not necessarily as deeply involved in his Judaism, but through the process of the candidacy and just everything having to do with the political world at that time. And also, I think by virtue of the fact that religion and politics often play a central role, like kind of work together in a variety of different ways, some of which we talked about,
Yes, indeed.
she encouraged him to go deeper into his faith. And I think for interfaithing couples, especially those in which one grew up Christian, one grew up Jewish, go deeper into your own Christianity, go deeper into your Judaism. And then, as we talked about before, the dinner table is that space for interfaith dialogue, right?
Exactly.
And
Yes.
that's the real wonderful work. How can we make
Mhm.
it happen in a way that is honoring our traditions,
Mhm.
being honoring who we are as a couple and as a family, and trying to find a way to take maybe that sense of loss and concern and really integrate it into then a desire to go deeper into that which you feel you have been taught and wanting to know more so that you can be able to do the job of honoring the legacy from which you come from.
Yes. Yes. That is such a beautifully stated point to, I think, end this particular conversation on, just as such a great reminder to our audience and to all those who are interested in interfacing. Don't forget about what can happen around that dining room table.
Mm-hmm.
The coming together, the sharing, the feeling even of sitting across from someone and watching them as they're expressing something that's clearly important to them and seeing that, light come into their eyes and just getting to observe and be a bear witness to that is such an impactful and like beautiful thing and way of interfacing couples and families showing one another
Right.
support and respect.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe in the future, we're going to have some opportunities for some more education, more learning for individuals within interfaithing families, both about Judaism, Christianity, other faith religions, as well as how to make it work, but as a way of continuing to grow their own learning so that the conversation at the dining room table is that much fuller and that much more creative and inspiring.
Indeed. Indeed. So we thank you all for joining us today. As a reminder for our Patreon members and for those who may be thinking about becoming a Patreon member, we do have a couple of special events in next month in February
Hmm.
that we are hoping that folks will be able to join us. Some more community members gathering time where Ari and I will be present. Some great crosstalk and sharing and getting to know one another within community will take place. So if you're not already on our Patreon, there is a free membership
Hmm.
tier that will allow you to gain access to these events, to episodes like this, as well as other materials. So if you are not already, please go to patreon.com backslash
Backslash. Yep.
interfaithing. I
Patreon.com
wanted
backslash interfaithing.
I
Absolutely.
wanted to make sure I got backslash, not forward slash.
If you could set the forward slash, you'd send them to the wrong site,
Oh
to the wrong
gosh.
place. All right. Well, it's
Or
always a
error not
pleasure.
found.
Always a pleasure, Ravana.
Always, always a pleasure with you as well, Rabbi. So until next time,
Take care
stay curious
and keep
and keep
interfaithing.
interfaithing.